What if the biggest threat to the WNBA right now isn't outside criticism, social media noise, or declining attention, but the league itself? Because according to reporting and commentary that has sent shockwaves through sports media, the WNBA may have just made a decision so short-sighted, so rooted in fear and control, that it risks undoing the fastest growth the league has ever experienced. This isn't about basketball strategy. It's not about locker room chemistry. And it's definitely not about on-court performance. This story begins in private meetings, quiet negotiations, and a refusal that changed the power dynamic overnight. Stephen A. Smith, the loudest, most influential voice in American sports media, didn't tiptoe around this. He didn't frame it as rumor or speculation dressed up as debate. He spoke with the kind of certainty that only comes when conversations have moved beyond whispers. According to Smith, the tension between the WNBA and Caitlin Clark has reached a point where disciplinary action was allegedly put on the table. Not because of misconduct, not because of a league violation, but because she refused to sign onto a deal that would have limited her autonomy. Let that sink in. Not a suspension tied to behavior. Not a punishment tied to performance. But a response to a no. That single refusal is what turned a league success story into a power struggle. For months, fans were told the WNBA was finally turning a corner. Ratings were exploding. Arenas were selling out. Merchandise demand was overwhelming supply. Media attention was no longer a charity. It was a bidding war. And at the center of that shift was Caitlin Clark, a rookie who didn't just bring eyeballs, but brought a new audience entirely. An audience that didn't grow up watching the league, didn't inherit loyalty to the Shield, and didn't feel obligated to stay if the product stopped making sense. That's what made this moment different. When Clark entered the league, she didn't arrive quietly. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't ease into relevance. She arrived with leverage already built, national recognition, corporate partnerships, and a personal brand that extended far beyond the boundaries of the WNBA. For the first time, the league wasn't introducing a star to the public. The public was introducing a star to the league. And that flipped the hierarchy upside down. Behind closed doors, negotiations weren't just about salaries or standard collective bargaining language. They were about control. About who decides how a player spends her off-season, where she plays, what league she can participate in, and how much of her own market value she's allowed to access independently. For decades, the WNBA operated under the assumption that players needed the league more than the league needed them. That assumption worked when overseas leagues were the only alternative. It doesn't work anymore. Clark's refusal wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't framed as rebellion. It was a calculated business decision from someone who understood the math, the timing, and the leverage better than the system she was pushing back against. And that's what made it dangerous. Because systems built on control don't panic when players complain. They panic when players understand their worth. The idea that a rookie, no matter how popular, would decline a framework designed to limit her options was never part of the league's plan. The expectation was compliance, patience, and gratitude. What they got instead was independence. According to Smith's commentary, that independence may have triggered a response the league never expected to justify publicly. The alleged consideration of suspension wasn't about enforcing rules. It was about sending a message. A reminder of who was supposed to be in charge. But when power has already shifted, reminders don't land the way they used to. This wasn't just a disagreement over paperwork. It was the moment the WNBA had to confront a reality it wasn't prepared for. The most valuable asset in the league no longer fits neatly inside its traditional structure. And once that realization sets in, every decision that follows becomes reactive, emotional, and risky. This story isn't about whether Caitlin Clark broke a rule. It's about whether the league broke its own future trying to prove it still had authority. The most important detail in this entire story is also the most misunderstood. Caitlin Clark didn't refuse the WNBA. She refused control disguised as protection. At no point was this about rejecting the league, ignoring teammates, or attempting to operate outside collective principles. What was allegedly placed in front of her was not a routine agreement meant to standardize player conditions. It was a framework designed to limit flexibility, particularly for players whose market value extends far beyond their base salary. And that distinction is everything. For years, collective bargaining in the WNBA functioned on a simple reality. The league needed cost certainty, and players needed stability. Salaries were modest. Overseas play filled the income gap. Endorsements existed, but they rarely created conflict because no single player's commercial footprint was powerful enough to disrupt the balance. That era ended the moment Caitlin Clark entered the league with a brand already built. The rumored issue wasn't salary caps or rookie scale numbers. It was autonomy. Specifically, how much control the league could exert over a player's off-season, endorsement calendar, and participation in non-WNBA competitions. For most players, those clauses are theoretical. For Clark, they're existential. Her earning potential doesn't live inside a league-issued paycheck. It lives in sponsorships, appearances, media deals, and basketball platforms that don't require WNBA permission to exist. That's why the refusal carried so much weight. From the league's perspective, allowing one player to operate with expanded freedom sets a precedent. If one rookie can say no, what happens when the next star follows? What happens when veterans realize the league's authority is negotiable? Collective bargaining relies on uniformity. Leverage relies on scarcity. Clark represents the opposite of both. But from Clark's perspective, the decision was straightforward. Signing away control over time, brand usage, or competitive opportunities in exchange for a capped salary makes no economic sense. Especially when that salary, even at its highest allowable level, doesn't remotely reflect her contribution to league revenue. This wasn't arrogance. It was arithmetic. The league reportedly framed the agreement as necessary for fairness and structure. Clark reportedly saw it as a ceiling. And ceilings are only invisible until you hit them. What makes this moment so volatile is that the refusal didn't happen quietly. It happened after a season where the league openly benefited from her presence. After ratings surged. After ticket prices spiked. After national broadcasts became must-watch events. The optics of demanding restriction after profiting from expansion couldn't have been worse. This is where the power struggle truly began. In leagues where stars depend on the system, refusals end careers. In leagues where the system depends on the star, refusals force negotiations. The WNBA is caught between those two realities, unsure which one applies anymore. Clark's no exposed that uncertainty in the most uncomfortable way possible. And once uncertainty enters leadership, responses stop being strategic. They become defensive. That's why this refusal didn't just stall paperwork. It triggered fear. Fear that the league might no longer be the primary gatekeeper of women's basketball success, and fear that control, once loosened, can't be reclaimed. The WNBA's biggest challenge right now isn't growth. It's who gets credit for it. For years, the league operated in survival mode. Broadcast deals were modest. Attendance fluctuated. Marketing budgets were thin. The long-term strategy was patience, slow expansion, controlled narratives, and collective messaging built around parity instead of superstardom. That model worked when expectations were low. It doesn't work when the numbers suddenly explode. And the numbers did explode. The arrival of Caitlin Clark didn't just increase interest, it redefined it. National broadcasts that once struggled to justify prime slots suddenly became appointment viewing. Arenas that previously relied on promotions to fill seats began selling out weeks in advance. Merchandise demand outpaced supply. Entire franchises experienced financial spikes that had nothing to do with roster construction or playoff contention. They had to do with visibility. That visibility translated directly into leverage. The uncomfortable truth inside league offices is this. A significant portion of the WNBA's recent financial momentum is traceable to a single gravitational pull. That doesn't mean other players don't matter. It means the catalyst matters. And catalysts disrupt systems that rely on slow, predictable change. The timing couldn't have been more sensitive. The WNBPA had already signaled dissatisfaction with the existing collective bargaining framework. Players wanted improved travel conditions, increased revenue sharing, and higher base salaries. Those demands were justified. But the leverage to make them real only arrived once money followed attention. And attention followed Clark. That creates a paradox the league wasn't prepared to handle. On one hand, the union needs Clark's popularity to strengthen its bargaining position. On the other hand, Clark's independence weakens the league's ability to negotiate from a position of authority. If the most valuable player doesn't financially depend on the system loses its primary pressure point. This is where the fear sets in. The league's historical power came from being the only viable domestic platform for elite women's basketball. That monopoly no longer exists. Endorsement money flows independently. Media access bypasses traditional league channels. And alternative leagues are no longer hypothetical. They're funded, organized, and actively recruiting. From a business perspective, Clark refusing restrictive terms isn't a personal challenge, it's a structural threat. It raises questions executives don't want asked publicly. How do you enforce collective limits when individual value is asymmetric? How do you argue fairness when revenue contribution isn't evenly distributed? And how do you maintain authority when your most profitable asset doesn't need you the way you need her? Those questions have no easy answers. What makes the situation even more volatile is the order in which everything happened. The league enjoyed the benefits first. The spotlight arrived. The deals followed. The momentum built. Only then did leadership attempt to reassert control. That sequence matters because it exposes motivation. It suggests the concern isn't about maintaining standards, it's about containing fallout. If Clark had been restricted before proving her value, the narrative would be different. But attempting to tighten boundaries after the market has spoken reads less like governance and more like panic. And panic is dangerous in any business. Especially one still fighting for legitimacy in a crowded sports landscape. By the time contract language became the public explanation, the emotional groundwork had already been laid. The tension surrounding Caitlin Clark didn't suddenly appear during negotiations. It had been building quietly, comment by comment, moment by moment, long before paperwork ever entered the conversation. And once you look back at the season through that lens, a pattern starts to emerge. One that's hard to ignore. It began with tone. Early remarks from veterans were framed as competitiveness, as "welcome to the league" realism. When Diana Taurasi made the now infamous "reality is coming" comment, it was brushed off as gamesmanship. At the time, it sounded harmless, almost traditional. A rite of passage. But in hindsight, it reads differently. Less like a challenge. More like a warning. As the season progressed, that tone hardened. Clark's records were questioned. Her impact was minimized. Her performances were reframed as hype rather than substance. In one of the more telling moments, Sheryl Swoopes publicly disputed Clark's accomplishments, getting basic facts wrong in the process. That wasn't competitive analysis. That was narrative erosion. And it happened in plain sight. What mattered just as much as the comments themselves was the response to them. There was no strong institutional pushback. No clear effort to protect the league's most visible rookie from becoming a lightning rod. Physical play against Clark escalated. Hard fouls turned into viral clips. Social media outrage spiked. Yet league leadership stayed largely silent, treating the hostility as part of the game instead of recognizing it as a business risk. That silence wasn't neutral. It was permissive. When leadership allows resentment to fester unchecked, it signals alignment, even if unintentionally. Players take cues from what's tolerated. Fans take cues from what's defended. And what fans saw was a league unwilling to step in when its most valuable new star became a target. This matters because culture doesn't change overnight. It hardens slowly. And by the time contractual disputes arise, they're no longer isolated issues. They're expressions of an environment that's already been shaped. By the time Clark refused the alleged agreement, she wasn't just negotiating with executives. She was pushing back against a culture that had made it clear she wasn't welcome to operate outside prescribed boundaries. The refusal wasn't a first strike. It was a response. And that's what makes the alleged disciplinary consideration feel less like enforcement and more like escalation. When resentment exists beneath the surface, authority stops being about rules and starts being about hierarchy. Who gets to speak? Who gets to benefit? And who is expected to fall in line regardless of impact? Clark's presence challenged that hierarchy the moment she arrived. Not because she demanded attention, but because attention followed her whether the league wanted it to or not. And in systems built on seniority and collective sameness, that kind of disruption is often met with resistance before it's ever met with adaptation. By the time negotiations reached a breaking point, the emotional verdict had already been rendered. The paperwork just gave it a trigger. And that's why this story can't be reduced to a contract dispute. It's the culmination of a season-long undercurrent that leadership chose not to confront, until it no longer could. The reason this situation escalated so quickly is simple. Caitlin Clark has somewhere else to go. For most of the WNBA's history, that sentence didn't matter. Players could push back, complain, or negotiate, But at the end of the day, the league was still the center of gravity. If you wanted visibility, legitimacy, and a domestic platform, the WNBA was the only option. That monopoly shaped every negotiation, every compromise, and every power dynamic. That monopoly is gone. The emergence of Unrivaled quietly rewrote the rules. On paper, it looks like an off-season alternative. In reality, it represents something far more destabilizing: choice. Higher guaranteed pay. Equity in the league itself. Centralized marketing. A schedule that doesn't demand year-round submission. And most importantly, respect for individual star power instead of suspicion toward it. For the first time, a top-tier women's basketball player doesn't need to leave the country to maximize her earning potential. She doesn't need to disappear into overseas leagues to subsidize her career. She can stay visible, stay domestic, and stay in control. That changes everything. From the league's perspective, this is terrifying. Because leverage only works when there's nowhere else to apply it. The moment an alternative becomes credible, authority weakens. Suddenly, suspensions don't scare players the way they used to. Restrictions don't feel like necessities. They feel like ultimatums, and ultimatums only work when the other side can't walk away. Clark can walk away. Not from basketball. Not from relevance. Not from money. Just from the idea that the WNBA is the sole gatekeeper of her career. And that reality shifts negotiations from enforcement to persuasion, a transition the league hasn't fully accepted yet. This context reframes the alleged contractual demands entirely. Limiting off-season participation isn't about player health. It's about competition. Restricting outside leagues isn't about fairness. It's about containment. When viewed through this lens, the refusal stops looking like defiance and starts looking like inevitability. The league knows this. Executives understand what happens if their most marketable player chooses a platform where she's celebrated instead of managed. They understand the optics of a future where alternative leagues draw comparable, or even higher, attention. And they understand the danger of creating a scenario where the WNBA is no longer the main event, but just one option among many. That's why this moment feels rushed. Reactive. Emotional. You don't threaten discipline when you're confident in your position. You threaten it when you feel leverage slipping. The very existence of Unrivaled removes the league's ability to rely on scarcity. And once scarcity disappears, control becomes negotiation whether leadership is ready for it or not. This isn't about Clark choosing another league tomorrow. It's about the league realizing she could, and that they wouldn't be able to stop her. That realization turns every hard stance into a gamble. Because if you push too hard, you don't just lose a negotiation. You create a competitor. Every crisis eventually lands at the same place. Leadership. And in this situation, all roads lead to Kathy Engelbert, a commissioner whose tenure has been defined less by decisive control and more by careful balancing. 4 years that approach worked. The WNBA didn't move fast enough to require bold, disruptive leadership. Stability mattered more than speed. Consensus mattered more than confrontation. But Caitlin Clark changed the tempo of everything. Suddenly, the league wasn't managing gradual growth. It was reacting to acceleration. Media cycles moved faster. Fan reactions intensified. Business decisions carried higher stakes. And every moment of hesitation became more visible. Engelbert found herself not just managing a league, but navigating competing power centers that wanted very different outcomes. On one side stood the veterans and union leadership. Players who fought for incremental gains over years, who endured lean seasons, modest pay, and limited exposure. For many of them, Clark's meteoric rise felt unfair, not because it wasn't earned, but because it arrived without the same struggle. Their influence within the league's internal politics is real, and their expectations of solidarity are deeply ingrained. On the other side stood the business reality. Sponsors, broadcasters, and partners who didn't invest in nostalgia or seniority. They invested in reach, visibility, growth. They invested in momentum. And momentum, whether the league liked it or not, had a name. Engelbert's challenge was supposed to be alignment, bringing these forces together under a shared vision. Instead, it appears she became the point of absorption for their conflict. Rather than setting a clear direction, leadership began reacting to pressure from all sides, trying to satisfy everyone while committing fully to no one. That's how authority erodes. When players sense hesitation, they push boundaries. When executives sense division, they stall decisions. And when stars sense uncertainty, they protect themselves. In that environment, even routine negotiations become battlegrounds because no one trusts the system to act predictably. The alleged consideration of disciplinary action doesn't suggest confidence. It suggests strain. It suggests a commissioner caught between appeasing veteran power structures and preserving the league's commercial future. And when those two goals collide, the instinct to enforce hierarchy often overrides the instinct to adapt. What makes this especially risky is perception. A commissioner doesn't need to be perfect, but she does need to be seen as decisive. When leadership appears reactive, every decision gets interpreted as political. Every rule enforcement feels selective. Every silence becomes suspicious. Engelbert's critics argue that this moment demanded clarity. An acknowledgement that the league had entered a new era where stars function as partners, not subordinates. Instead, the response appears to reflect an older model of control, one that assumes authority is preserved through restriction rather than earned through alignment. That model doesn't age well. Especially not in a league trying to convince the world it's ready for prime time. If this dispute truly reached the point of considering suspension over contractual refusal, it signals a leadership style under stress, one prioritizing order over evolution. And history shows that leagues facing transformative moments rarely survive them intact if leadership chooses preservation of power over expansion of possibility. At this stage, the question isn't whether Engelbert can enforce authority. It's whether enforcing it will cost the league more than it can afford to lose. At a certain point, internal politics stop mattering, because the people funding the operation start asking questions. That point may have already arrived. The recent surge in WNBA visibility didn't happen in a vacuum. It was followed closely by corporate commitments, long-term media agreements, and strategic partnerships that assumed one core thing: momentum would continue. Those deals weren't built around abstract ideals like parity or internal harmony. They were built around audience behavior, ratings, engagement, viral reach, and most importantly, consistency. This is where the alleged suspension narrative becomes a financial risk instead of a cultural one. Broadcast partners don't invest billions to watch their primary draw sidelined over administrative disputes. Advertisers don't align with a league undergoing a public power struggle that threatens its most recognizable figure. These entities don't care about internal hierarchies or union politics. They care about predictability. And unpredictability is poison to long-term planning. The uncomfortable reality is that many of the league's newest fans didn't arrive because they suddenly discovered the WNBA brand. They arrived because they followed Caitlin Clark, from college arenas to professional ones. Their loyalty isn't institutional. It's personal. Remove the reason they tuned in, and there's no guarantee they'll stay. That's not speculation. That's how modern sports consumption works. Streaming-era audiences don't inherit allegiance. They choose it. And they leave just as easily. This generation of fans isn't waiting 20 years to develop attachment. They move on the moment content stops delivering value. The WNBA's recent growth came from tapping into that reality, not from changing it. Which is why the backlash online matters. When phrases like boycott begin trending, it's easy for executives to dismiss them as noise. But digital behavior translates into real metrics: canceled subscriptions, declining viewership, and softened demand. Even a short disruption can cause long-term damage when a league is still trying to establish trust with new consumers. From a business standpoint, this is the nightmare scenario. The league finally had leverage with networks. It finally had data to justify higher valuations. It finally had cultural relevance beyond niche circles. And all of that momentum rests on a fragile foundation: continued access to the product people showed up to see. If Clark is perceived, fairly or not, as being pushed out, silenced, or punished for understanding her value, that foundation cracks. Fans don't interpret nuance. They interpret stories. And the story being told right now is dangerously simple. The league is willing to hurt itself to prove a point. That's not a story advertisers want attached to their brand. This isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding consequences. Business partners didn't sign up for chaos. They signed up for growth. And growth doesn't survive internal warfare, especially when it plays out in public view. Once confidence erodes at the corporate level, recovery becomes exponentially harder. Deals get renegotiated. Future investments slow. And the league finds itself explaining decisions instead of celebrating success. That's when momentum dies. And momentum, once lost, is far harder to rebuild than it is to protect. Long before contract language and suspension rumors entered the conversation, there was a warning sign hiding in plain sight. The Olympic decision. When the Team USA roster was announced and Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it, the explanation sounded familiar. Experience. Chemistry. Fit. On paper it was defensible. In reality, it revealed something deeper about how the league and its power centers were thinking. Because the Olympics aren't just about winning games, they're about global exposure, marketing leverage, and defining who represents the sport to the world. Leaving Clark off that stage wasn't a basketball decision. It was a hierarchy decision. At the time, leadership framed it as patience. Let her wait. Let her earn it. Let her fall in line with the traditional timeline of respect. But that logic ignored a critical factor. Clark wasn't asking for access. She was already delivering value. International fans knew her name. Broadcasters wanted her face. Sponsors understood her reach. The Olympics weren't an opportunity for Clark. They were an opportunity for the league. And the league passed. That decision cost visibility. It cost momentum. And it sent a message that reverberated far beyond Paris. The message wasn't that standards mattered. It was that disruption wouldn't be rewarded, even when it benefited everyone involved. Now, viewed through the lens of the current dispute, the Olympic omission looks less like an isolated call and more like a precedent. When confronted with a choice between protecting hierarchy and accelerating growth, leadership chose hierarchy. When faced with the chance to embrace a new center of gravity, it opted to preserve the old one. The alleged suspension threat follows the same logic. First, limit access. Then, enforce patience. Then, frame resistance as non-compliance. It's the same song, just with higher stakes. The difference this time is that the cost of containment has multiplied. Missing the Olympics hurt exposure. Missing regular season WNBA games due to a contract standoff would hurt revenue, trust, and credibility. It would validate every critic who ever argued that the league wasn't structurally prepared to handle a true superstar. And unlike the Olympic decision, this one can't be reframed quietly. Fans understand what they're watching now. They recognize patterns. They connect dots. And once a pattern becomes visible, it's nearly impossible to deny. This is no longer about whether Clark deserves special treatment. It's about whether the league understands that moments like these define eras. The Olympics were a missed opportunity. A suspension, formal or informal, would be a self-inflicted wound. Because history doesn't remember the explanations. It remembers the outcomes. And if this situation ends with the league sidelining the player most responsible for its growth, the explanation won't matter. The damage will speak for itself. Strip away the rumors, the negotiations, and the power plays, and what's left is a question the WNBA can't avoid anymore. What do you do when the future arrives faster than your system can handle? Because Caitlin Clark didn't break the league. She revealed it. She exposed a structural tension that had been quietly building for years. The gap between a league designed to manage scarcity and a reality suddenly defined by abundance. Abundance of attention. Abundance of options. Abundance of player leverage. The WNBA spent decades asking to grow the game, asking for visibility, asking for relevance. And when it finally arrived, it didn't come in a controlled, committee-approved form. It came attached to one player who didn't need permission to be valuable. That's what made this moment so destabilizing. The alleged suspension consideration, whether it becomes formal or fades behind closed doors, already did its damage. It told fans, partners, and players exactly how fragile the league's confidence still is. Instead of embracing a new era where stars function as partners in growth, leadership appeared to reach for old tools: restriction, hierarchy, and discipline. Tools that work when players have nowhere else to go. Tools that fail the moment choice enters the equation. This situation was never really about a contract clause. It was about control. About whether the league could still dictate the terms of success in a world where individual brands now rival institutions. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is this: the league no longer holds all the cards. If the WNBA adapts, if it recognizes that modern sports ecosystems reward collaboration over containment, It has a chance to turn this moment into a foundation for long-term dominance. But if it doubles down on fear, if it punishes independence instead of integrating it, the cost won't just be one player. It will be trust, momentum, and the very audience the league fought so hard to attract. History is full of organizations that survived criticism but collapsed under pride. The ones that endure are the ones that evolve when power shifts, not the ones that try to pretend it hasn't. The WNBA stands at that crossroads right now. And whatever choice it makes next won't just define Caitlin Clark's future. It will define whether the league is ready to exist in the future it spent decades asking for. If you found this breakdown useful and you want more deep, technical storytelling like this, without the media spin, help support the channel. The subscriber count is still small, but that's how channels like this grow. Subscribe so you don't miss future breakdowns like the video. It directly helps push this content to more viewers. Leave a comment with your thoughts, even if you disagree. Engagement tells the algorithm this conversation matters, and there's a lot more to uncover. If you want the next story, make sure you're part of it.